everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the SFC Bookcast, where, again, we are discussing the Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover. If you've not seen episode 1, I highly encourage you to do so. It is up on the channel. But for now, we are continuing with chapters 5 and chapter 8. Today we have with us
Jawa,
JC,
Jarrett,
and myself, Noah. And I really don't have much else to say beyond we can get into this.
oh man, I love Grievous in this book. I feel like I might be the controversial opinion to love this Grievous because I know Jar Jar said he doesn't.
I really liked him. I thought he was scarier in this book than ever that I've seen, at least. Like, he's just straight up smashing guys, like, dudes' heads in. And, like, it's talking about him wiping the brains off of his fists and all sorts of stuff. And I'm like, this is freaky.
Now you still haven't watched the Clone Wars, right, Jawa? You haven't seen the 2003 Clone Wars cartoon the whole way?
I haven't seen all of it. I've started it. I'm about a third of the way through it.
Oh, man, dude, Grievous is amazing. Oh, okay. The General Grievous in that show, in like it's the next 2/3 of the cartoon, has Grievous as like the primary antagonist, and he is literally. I mean, they talk about he walked on talent creations of magnetized uranium, and he can grab and crush like a blood eagle. He's got that like in the cartoon, and it's a cartoon, but he's still like grabbing people with his feet and just slamming them into the ground or throwing them around. It's spectacular and it's brutal, and they went full horror flick with this.
Quick question. What is it with villains in Star Wars just dropping their underlings with the flick of a wrist?
I really don't know, and I thought about the exact same thing when I was reading the audiobook. I was like, why do bad guys feel this urge to just knock their underlings, their workers, to the ground at like the slightest inconvenience? They're just like, oh, I woke up on the left side of the bed today, gotta snap someone's neck.
Well, that's what makes, and I know this is way off kilter from this book, but that's what makes Grand Admiral Thrawn so intimidating, is that he will instill respect in his crew. He'll be like, you made a mistake. All right, now let's rectify this mistake.
Oh, definitely. That is the biggest difference between like Thrawn and any other Imperial villain or Separatist villain for that matter.
I love it. It's just like, even Tarkin would just be like, take him away, disintegrate him or something. Like, I have no use for you.
Thinking about it, that is another thing that probably sets Dooku apart too. Because Dooku, he mentions in the last, like we talked about last week,
About Grievous and everything.
he mentions, like, yeah, he just sees everybody completely beneath him, but he's not the kind of person to just go around killing people because of it. Here we have Grievous wiping Neimoidian brains off of his fists twice.
Which I honestly love, because in the movie, and still, regardless, I love the character from the movies, but he's kind of depicted as this like really imposing yet cowardly figure. Like, he definitely has the this presence, but whenever he's actually he knows he's on the losing side of something, he just bails. So it's really refreshing, and I really, really loved when we were reading this very first chapter, and he just drops one of these random ship crewmates just with a punch, and it talks about just he flattened this man's skull, and I was like, oh, wow.
This book is a lot more graphic than I thought it was going to be. There's like in one of the later chapters, it's like they are just throwing corpses out of chairs, and it's like there's blood all over the place. I'm like, this is really dark for a Star Wars book.
Yeah, I mean, even Obi-Wan's head wound is like, even though he's like I know this is further on, but just that, like, we don't really see Obi-Wan being in pain from his injuries and stuff after being knocked out. It's just like, okay, well, he needs to be okay for the movie to keep going, so he's fine. But for this, they actually kept referring back to it, and after near the end of this whole thing, they talk about, does he want to do an infirmary thing and how he doesn't want to do that so that there are more medical people available for all the citizens on Coruscant.
Oh, and the fact that in the next chapter it talks about the Magna Guards and how Anakin suspects that they have blood caking their capes.
Oh man, that is so like I love it because like I could probably get into a whole thing about the canonicity of these things and how Clone Wars undid a lot of its canonicity, but I do like that aspect that like they're these new creatures that are also like instilling terror in the two best Jedi.
Getting back to people being killed by their leaders for seemingly no reason, Captain Nita makes an appearance.
Oh, yes, he does. And he seems like a good guy, actually.
But he was a bold good guy. He was like, "Hey Grievous, I'm not afraid of you. Like, I'll call your bluff."
I was surprised at how like good he was at going toe to toe with arguing with Grievous.
What happened to him?
Well, that's the thing, though. I mean, Nita stayed the same, more or less. I mean, he got promoted up the ranks of the Empire, but eventually he thought, well, he got kind of cocky. He's like, I'm bold enough to confront Grievous toe to toe over the hologram. I'm sure an apology to Vader will be just fine. Like,
Oh, that's fair.
but that boldness didn't pay off. With Grievous, I think it's interesting that they bring up, he can't laugh, and he can only sort of have not really feelings, but he has things resembling, frustration and stuff. And yet you see already the cracks in that, in how he's like, like he'll slam his fist and be like, find them, like it's clear that, I don't know, Grievous is, I mean, in canon, of course, Grievous laughs a lot. In the movie, even he laughs. I mean, but that's not very much what fits in with this book. But to be fair, they said in this book that he won't get angry, and yet he's already had outbursts that we've seen. So I don't know if, when speaking about Grievous, that's really a reliable narrator there.
Does anybody have that passage on hand that we can read?
I do. Which passage specifically?
Speaking about Grievous's just lack of humanity.
Oh, yes. Okay, where is that?
On that topic, when they mention a long time ago he had things to love, I thought that was really neat that they referenced that, because in Legends, Grievous had a girl he loved, and she was killed in a battle that the Jedi aided the opposite side. And Grievous actually he gave himself the name Grievous due to grieving this girl he loved loss.
Okay, and here is the passage. Touching these souvenirs with his hands of armor-plast and durasteel brings him something resembling joy. But only resembling. He remembers joy. He remembers anger and frustration. He remembers grief and sorrow. He doesn't actually feel any of them. Not anymore. He's not designed for it.
That last line, he's not designed for it, was like, ooh, even with somebody else reading it, I was like, ooh, that is good. Because it's like, it's kind of a really good analogy. Again, we've had this conversation before about Maul, Dooku, and Vader kind of being parts of a whole that becomes Vader later on, but it's just a really great comparison to like this lack of humanity, and it's just this, he's cold, he's heartless, he's not designed to feel because it's no longer a part of his being.
It reminds me of Anakin, like you said, like it's like he used to have all of these emotions, but they've been stripped away from him.
Kind of like the Jedi require you to do in the first place.
Yes, it is. And ironically, the main problem, well, the thing that sends Anakin to the dark side and redeems him is the fact that unlike the Jedi or unlike the Sith, he is like emotion is what makes him Anakin. Like that is probably the biggest part of Anakin Skywalker is just his wealth of emotion. The Jedi tried to stamp it out of him. Vader's body tried to completely disintegrate it, but neither could do the job completely. And in one case, it ended with like horrible for the whole galaxy, and in the other, the exact opposite.
Going back momentarily to that bit we were talking about with Grievous's backstory in Legends, and the piece that kind of teases it or mentions it in the novel, it's just another tease about Grievous's backstory. And I was talking to JC about this before we started the recording. But with, especially in new canon, we get so much more backstory with Maul and Dooku and Ventress even, that it's really such a detailed backstory about what happened in between the films. We get barely anything with Grievous. We get maybe 2 episodes of a short little arc where Kit Fisto accidentally goes to Grievous's lair. But I want a novel, a comic, something that tells us in new canon how Grievous became the thing that we see him in the movies, because currently there is no explanation for it. The reason Dooku went to the dark side and left the Jedi Order, we have so much with Maul. We have this complete arc and storyline with Maul. It's honestly almost comparable to like the story that we get with Vader in the original trilogy. Just how much content Maul has. And Grievous has barely anything.
Whenever new canon doesn't touch on something like that, I think it's either because they have a story planned or they're willing to sort of just consider what happened in Legends as what happened in canon, because that's kind of the path they're taking with the Old Republic, even if the High Republic is kind of changing some stuff. I think we're able to still consider the Old Republic as more or less what happens in canon, and I think the same applies to Grievous.
I think Grievous's backstory has weirdly been George Lucas had one idea, Dave may have had another idea, and then Legends had its own storyline. So the thing with George's that was really interesting is George was like, oh well, Grievous was he always wanted to be a Jedi, and he would train and he would fight and he would try so hard, got to the top of his kind of the food chain of the Kalish world, and he was kind of the warlord of Kali, and he went to the Jedi to try and be a Jedi, but his lack of Force sensitivity and the Jedi brushing him off, kind of like Mr. Incredible syndrome style, enraged Grievous, and he went for revenge, and he started modifying himself bit by bit. And it is a far cry from the whole, he was fighting and the Jedi were on the opposite side, and he crashes his ship or his pod because Dooku zapped it, and then Dooku blasted it, and then he keeps Grievous alive and puts him in the Bacta tank and fills him with Sifo-Dyas's blood, all the ridiculousness that was in that version, even though I think that version's cooler.
I honestly prefer Lucas's version, because we never really get a story about somebody in old canon or new that I'm aware of, well, in new canon, or that I can recall, where where somebody really, really sought after becoming a Jedi, but has just no Force sensitivity. And so he's like obsessed with the Jedi culture, And so that could be the reason why he collects lightsabers and is so honed in so many different styles of lightsaber combat, is he's trying his absolute hardest to emulate being a Jedi. Despite all this hatred for them, he still has some sort of admiration for the Order and wants to be a part of it.
Can you imagine how great it would have been had Dooku been like, "Hey Grievous, look, I'm in the same boat. I left the Jedi because of their hypocrisy too. Like, we've dealt with the Jedi's hubris and all their stuff for all these years. Together, you and I could rule. We just have to take out Palpatine together, But it would. Dooku is way too prideful to ever ask such an intolerant creature, such things.
Oh yeah. If the last episode made anything clear, it's that Dooku abhors Grievous.
Mhm.
I don't think it's as bad in the new canon as it is in this novel, though. I don't believe Dooku as a character is as bigoted, I suppose is the word, than in the new canon as in the old. Like in the old canon, he is abysmal. But in the new canon, and it could just be because we have more characterization of him as seeing him in a different light, but he doesn't seem like as much of a bigot.
In the Jedi Lost book, I won't go into it in too much detail for spoiler reasons, but just Dooku doesn't strike me as terribly racist or anything.
So, we've spent a lot of time talking about Grievous himself. So, I think we can pretty safely move on to, and since they're kind of the same story, we can move on to chapter 6 and 7 being Rescue
Oh boy.
and Anakin and Obi-Wan 2.
Oh,
Somebody
boy.
mute Jawa, quick.
All
mute
right.
Jawa.
Mute Jawa.
Here we go.
Mute him.
Here we
Mute
go.
Mute him. Mute
Here
him.
we go.
Do it quick. Do it quick. Do it.
Obi-Wan Kenobi opened his eyes to find himself staring at what he strongly suspected was Anakin's butt. It looked like Anakin's butt. Well, his pants anyway. Though it was thoroughly impossible for Obi-Wan to be certain, since he had never before had occasion to examine Anakin's butt upside down, which it currently appeared to be, nor from this rather uncomfortably close range.
I think, yeah, that's enough to give people an idea.
I have to say something because this chapter reinvigorated my love for Obi-Wan in this book, because if you will recall in the last episode, I didn't like his characterization because he was this overly strict, uptight father figure, and he wasn't the jokey guy that we know, especially in the new canon. This chapter reinvigorated that and dialed it up to 11. This vision of Anakin's butt upon reawakening from this deep slumber has reawakened some hibernating part of himself that he never knew was there, and now he is his old self again.
I have a bad feeling about this.
He's flustered, really, is in this entire chapter. He's just like, oh my.
I think it's the fact that they finally defeated Dooku, and that was the main goal for them. And so now Obi-Wan feels like he can loosen up just a bit, since they now have the Chancellor. They've rescued him, but now it's just a matter of getting down safely to the planet below.
Also, I brought this up in the last episode as well. I was like, did Obi-Wan ever find out that Anakin killed Dooku? And we discussed it for a little while, but we actually see it in this chapter, and his immediate reaction is, oh, that's too bad. He could have been of use. Oh well. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad you mentioned it, because in the movie, I don't believe it's ever touched on until he's like, oh, Anakin killed Grievous. And it's like, oh, awesome. Moving on. But we never actually see Anakin said, oh, but by the way, yeah, I killed Dooku. And he's like, oh, cool.
I like that his line about Dooku could have been in use. My very first thought was back to the Clone Wars when they're both trapped, all three of them are trapped by Hondo, and they have to sort of work together. And so I know that's not at all what it's referencing, but I choose to accept that it is a reference to that.
Choose to believe that Obi-Wan's first intent was to try and bring Dooku back in and see if he could be
I wouldn't say back in and turn him. That's not exactly what I mean. I mean more that he remembers when they had to work together to escape from the pirates, and he knows that Dooku is a very capable fighter, and when it comes to it, if his life is on the line, Dooku would, in fact, work with Anakin and Obi-Wan to at least save himself.
Well, I mean, I agree. But I think it's also the matter that it brought up to me. The first thing when I read it was also Clone Wars, but it was season 7, and spoiler alert on that front. But just that Dooku talks about, or Obi-Wan mentions about, any chance of learning more about Sidious from Dooku is, lost to us now because of this, And so I feel like that might have been part of his reasoning, is he's still trying to help figure out the identity of Sidious in some way or other.
As a brief summary of what happens in these two chapters, Anakin and Obi-Wan have Palpatine, and they are attempting to escape with him, but then they find out but then they are trapped by Grievous and the Magna Guards and brought to Grievous's bridge, wherein they have a fight, and then the ship starts crashing, and Anakin has to not crash it.
Well, one thing that is really neat throughout this entire few chapters, and even the last chapter before that we took our break during, literally ever since the duel, Palpatine has been like, leave Obi-Wan behind. Seriously, like, I need you to grab onto me instead of him. I need you.
Yeah, that was one of my notes. It's like Palpatine just keeps trying to trick Anakin into leaving Obi-Wan behind.
I wouldn't even say tricking.
Grievous is on this ship. We gotta go get Grievous, and he's like, "Well, I can't carry Obi-Wan that far, and he can't fight right now." And he's like, "Well, let's just go anyway." And then when they're in the elevator, he's like, "Come on, Anakin, you have to help me up. You gotta drop Obi-Wan."
One of the biggest things that I stood out to me in these two chapters is that Palpatine is like really annoying. Like, it's the point, but he's like playing this role of the a civilian who is not cut out for all of this warfare, and so he is like annoyingly concerned with his own life and getting saved, and it really starts to grate.
It really adds to the banter between Anakin and Obi-Wan, I feel like, though, especially when Obi-Wan wakes back up.
Oh, definitely.
It's so wonderful that, like, these two are just bouncing off one another in their conversation, and you can tell that they have been together for a while.
And Palpatine the whole time is like, "What are you two talking about? We need to live!"
Yes, exactly. Oh, I love this chapter. These two chapters.
I do like that they kind of kept the when they do get trapped by the ray shields, and Obi-Wan's like, "Why did this happen? We're smarter than this."
How did this happen? We're smarter than this, apparently.
Oh! One more thing. We talked about how Palpatine is like trying to get him to leave Obi-Wan behind the whole time. But there's another parallel between the Jedi and the Sith, in that Obi-Wan tried to get him to leave behind R2.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
And Anakin is adamant about not leaving anybody behind.
Both of them are weirdly trying to make him separate his attachments for very different reasons, but they're both after, in some ways, the same goal. Palpatine and for very different reasons, but Palpatine and Obi-Wan both want him to let go of his emotions and his attachments to certain people and characters that we know. Something that Jawa mentioned that Noah brought up, but I feel like it needs to be brought up again just briefly, is Palpatine never tries to deceive Anakin. He's very actively, he's not trying to make him do something. He's not trying to make him do something against his will. He wants to make sure that Anakin does it of his own free will, so that he knows nobody made me do this. I did this. And so we see that guilt that we again see when he first kills Dooku is like, I wanted permission, but he didn't make me do that. I did that.
I think I should have reworded that when I said that earlier, and I think Noah called me on it, where I said Palpatine was trying to trick Anakin. He's not really trying to trick him, as more persuade him, like make him lean towards the wrong thing to do.
Right, because if he doesn't make the choices himself, if he doesn't make the choices of his own accord, then is he ever really Darth Vader down the line? You know, like, or was he just another pawn of Sidious?
And it really is that he's trying to, like, he knows that Obi-Wan is the angel to Palpatine's devil, and so if Obi-Wan is out of the picture, then he will have practically no obstacle to sway Anakin to his side. But since he won't willingly forsake Obi-Wan, there's, if he has to do that later.
Did you notice the one scene, though? It cracked me up, because there was the one moment where Palpatine's like, you go deal with Dooku, Obi-Wan, I'll stay here with Obi-Wan, he can protect me if need be, and I'll be with him. But it's like, clearly, if Anakin were to have gone right then to face Grievous probably would have escaped, like he would have anyway. And I feel like Palpatine would have just killed Obi-Wan like that and been like, I lost him, I'm so sorry, he died sacrificing himself to save me.
He's like, I'm sorry, Anakin. He just stopped breathing.
He stubbed his toe.
He lost the will to live.
Perhaps he knew about your killing Dooku.
Ooh. Thanks for turning it really dark once again.
Maybe your butt was too much for him.
Adam,
maybe you farted in his face and you made him pass out.
He saw the butt and it was too much for him.
Okay, and we're going on.
So how about when they're captured and they meet Grievous?
That is a good scene. Oh, we talked last week about all of the visualization in the Force that was really touched on the High Republic as well. But this is so cool to see how Obi-Wan sees everything.
Obi-Wan sees the Force as a waterfall, and that was like, oh, that's good.
And I love how he talks about how once he is in the Force, he ceases to exist. And he is just the Force. He is everything in the Force. He feels the dents in R2's treads. He feels the crack in the wall. He feels Anakin ready to attack. He feels Grievous about ordering them dead.
That was probably my favorite part of all the chapters we've read.
The thing that's really neat to me about Obi-Wan viewing it like a waterfall is because in the Jedi Apprentice books, which are all about Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon training together over the years, from him getting first chosen by Qui-Gon and then all their adventures up to Phantom Menace, Obi-Wan's most Force-centric moments, his most centered moments, and the most personal, intimate moments in those books are when he goes to a place in the temple called the Room of a Thousand Fountains.
I would say the very next big thing is the whole sequence of events where Grievous grabs the Magna Guard staff, throws it at the window, everything goes to crap, and then Anakin has to wrangle the ship.
Well, I had a couple things before the big escape. One of the things in Chapter 6 wasn't related to Grievous, but it was Anakin thinking about when he gave Padme C-3PO, and then later on when she gave Anakin R2.
I thought that was such a great detail because I don't recall it from the movie, but I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Oh, and I love it. Gosh, I love this book so much more now.
What does a Jedi have use for a protocol droid? What does a politician have use for an astromech?
I love the cheesiness between them, and they're the cutest thing. But
The dialogue wasn't as clunky as it is in the movies, and I was glad.
Oh, yeah.
It's still
Yeah.
cheesy, but it's less clunky.
yeah, it's less McClunky.
Oh,
I kick him.
So
Yeah.
you know how we were talking about clunky dialogue and then you shoehorned in a reference to McClunky? That was clunky.
So one thing with that, they do show in the 2003 Clone Wars, they also show a different perspective of some of that some of that sequence of events of the the Padawan braid and the 3PO and his gold plating. And it's really sweet, but it's there's some timeline issues definitely with how they did it, because Anakin gives her, well, I guess it works, yeah, because he had, okay, never mind. I was gonna say there was a continuity error, but I don't think there was, because he used in the '03 Clone Wars, which this book is canon to, he took R4 for a lot of missions before Ventress blew him up, and then but then Obi-Wan got a new R4 or repaired R4 only for him to get his head shot off by the battle droids, and then he gets a completely different R4 that's in gold instead of red for his Utapau mission. But the one thing that I was going to mention that was before all the escape stuff is this kind of subtle thing they talk about briefly, where they say about the gravity generator is like flipped, and so like the whole gravity of the ship and everything changes, and it some walls are now the floor and the ceiling, and all those things are kind of flipped. And that's something that was one of George's ideas. It was in the concept art for the film. It was in the video game, and I loved it because you could be on, the ship would kind of rotate as you fought the Magna Guards and stuff. But best of all, only recently, I don't think it's been released ever until Revenge of the Sith hit Disney Plus, we got a deleted scene that shows some of the gravity shifting hijinks that happened, and it's just amazing to see something very similar to what's in this book, but it's we actually get to see new footage, so to speak, of Ewan and Hayden and Ian McDermott, all try to deal with this gravity changing. It's pretty fun.
Wasn't there a deleted scene for Revenge of the Sith where Grievous confronts them when they're in like the
Yeah.
force field, basically, and murders Shaak Ti in front of them?
Not in the force field, but it's before that. They moved the bridge scene.
Okay, I was expecting to see that in this book, and we never did. Because I vividly remember seeing it on the bonus disc for the DVD, and I was like, "Oh, that's really cool."
In the behind the scenes situation, I think the book and the one deleted scene, that's set later on, those are both the canon version of what happens to Shaak Ti, and we'll get to that when that happens. But what happened, the reason it's different, originally, they specifically were like, hey, the book's already too far along in the process to make such a fundamental change now, but we'd really like, and they kept it for a long time in the production, but they're like, we'd like to have Shaak Ti's homing beacon be what Anakin and Obi-Wan are following to get to the invisible hand.
Oh.
And it was that instead of, in the 2003 Clone Wars, they do show Grievous and Shaak Ti fighting and everything, and there's a moment where he sort of captures her ish. I'm not trying to spoil this for anybody, but he sort of captures her ish, and then what they did is originally George was like, I love that. I'll put that in there. I'll make sure that it's like Shakti's homing beacon is what they're following. He took Shakti and Palpatine, and then he kills Shakti in cold blood in front of them. But they ended up deleting the sequence, and they moved everything important into the bridge sequence that we got. But what's interesting is then the Clone Wars had to go back and animate a scene where Mace finds Shakti still on Coruscant, just all tied up and being like, I failed. And it's like, oh, okay, like, because they're like, well, crap, we set up your whole thing for you, thanks a lot. But it was really interesting. It doesn't really make too much sense why he would just tie her up, because she was already pretty much defeated, but I guess it's so that she wouldn't try to pursue them any further. And it explains why only Anakin and Obi-Wan, for some reason, can go after Palpatine, which I still don't get why, even in this book or any of these things, why Mace and Yoda can't just go after him.
I would like to say that the crash landing sequence gives me such a great appreciation for it. Like, when you're watching Revenge of the Sith, you're kind of just like, oh yeah, Anakin takes control of the ship, they're fine, whatever. But they make a point to stress that this is like legendary. Like, Anakin is controlling this hunk of metal that shouldn't even be able to fly at this point, and the fact that he's able to bring it down without killing anybody inside and still like being able to fly it at all is they like say it's like the definition of impossible. But then Anakin, it's just his thing. And the way that it reads that he views the Force, he kind of views the Force as just something that he controls. And so he brings it, like, whenever he needs it, he just, like, calls it up. And one of my favorite lines is, between his will and the will of the Force, there is no contest.
During this bit where he's like, this is Anakin Skywalker during his finest hour, that short passage, the second half of it, as it's closing out, before we move on to another portion, in the audiobook, I don't know if now it's considered the Skywalker theme or the Force thing, but the that one.
Yeah, it's a Force theme.
It was playing as he was reading, and I was like, this is good. But as it's pumping you up, and as he's like increasing the volume of his voice, saying Anakin will prevail at this impossible feat because he is Anakin Skywalker, it's like da 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 da, and I was like, this is good.
This book does a really good job of making like me appreciate things that were in the movie but were never really touched on that much, and then just bringing the attention to this is actually something that is really important.
Yeah, I started rewatching the movie some last night, and I realized that our first episode when we read chapters 1 through 4, that's only the first 15 minutes of the movie, and the fight between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Dooku, it felt so short and so rushed compared to the book. Like, they almost immediately start fighting as soon as they enter the bridge where the Chancellor is, and it's like you don't get any of that dialogue that's in the book, that like their whole conversation before they start fighting.
Yeah, and aren't you a little afraid to be, or aren't you a little old to be afraid of the dark? I wish that line had been in the movie. That would be.
I think this is a good place to move into the last chapter, Fault Lines, which is pretty big. The main focus of the summary of the chapter is they finally return to Coruscant, triumphant and having rescued Palpatine, and they are greeted by Mace Windu.
Mace is ever the jerk, as always, but I do love him in this book. Matthew Stover writes a great Mace Windu, and probably the most multifaceted, most character developed Mace that we get, because he did Shatterpoint and Revenge of the Sith.
This chapter and the way that the author depicts Windu makes me want to read a Windu novel because of just how well characterized and just how much it fits his character from the movie.
Well, I mean, that's what Shatterpoint really is.
Shatterpoint, is it named after Windu's how he visualizes the Force, which is like fault lines where everything is connected by these like shatter points, where Mace Windu is able to visualize how one can break and how he can use them to his advantage.
And it's so dark, and it's just so Mace Windu of him. Like, using Vapod and using the Shatterpoint are both so dark side, and it's like, you can tell that had he not actively pursued the path of the Jedi, he would have been so easy to convert into a really powerful Sith. But yeah, Shatterpoint would be the book you're looking for, Jarrett, because it's also a Matthew Stover book, and I loved it from the minute I read the intro, because it's literally, I forget if it's Mace in therapy or if it's just Mace talking to himself, but I think it might have been Mace in kind of a Jedi therapy that they had for survivors of the Battle of Geonosis, and he's dealing with this trauma of, I had my saber at Dooku's throat, why didn't I kill him? If I had just done it right then, I wouldn't have so many dead friends right now.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I picked up on and I put in my notes. It's like Mace Windu really regrets not killing Dooku when he had the chance. That's like one of the things that weighs on him the most.
He mentions that he could never forget the clone pilot's face because it's the face that reminded him that he let Dooku go.
Yeah, that's the line that I had in my notes.
And he doesn't care at all about the guy. He's not feeling guilt because he beheaded the kid's dad in front of him. No, he doesn't care about that at all.
That wouldn't be Mace Windu.
Nope. I love the Clone Wars. I know this is a smidge of a tangent, but not exactly. It's still on Mace's personality. Just that, when he's like, I know I've done terrible things, but you started it when you killed my father. And he's like, you're just going to have to forgive me. And it's like, wow, what a loser.
I love that, like, almost immediately, Mace is he's ecstatic that they've killed Dooku, and that brings him one more step closer to the end of the war. But as Anakin starts to rely on Palpatine a bit to get him through this one meeting, like, his mood immediately shifts. He's like, okay, I don't think it's great that you like Palpatine this much. How about we dial it back a bit?
Mm-hmm. And then when Palpatine tries to compliment him in his fake Palpatine way still, but he's like, the Jedi are happy to do what they can to help the Senate, and he's like, I am the Senate. Oh wait, that's not yet.
oh yeah, Palpatine. I looked again. Palpatine still never lies once in these 4 chapters. I'm still gonna be looking out for that, but it still holds, because all he says about, like, Dooku, that's something he could lie about. Like, Dooku was about to kill me, and Anakin jumped in the way right as he did. But all he says is, perhaps young Anakin was simply more highly motivated. After all, Dooku was fighting only to slay an enemy. Anakin was fighting to save, if I may presume the honor, a friend. There's not a single lie.
I love it and hate it all at once, because he's perfect at that slithery evil, yet completely, like, he really seems like he's a good friend type of person, but he's just the worst.
Well, and he's telling the truth too. He doesn't even say, I consider Anakin a friend. He's saying Anakin was fighting to save, like, from Anakin's perspective, he's fighting to save a friend.
Baffles me how close the Jedi were to discovering it was Palpatine all along.
That's exactly what I was getting ready to say.
They even went so far as to say the Sith Lord could be controlling Palpatine. And I'm like, you're so close.
Because Obi-Wan or somebody was like, why could it be Palpatine? And Mace Windu's like, no, it can't be Palpatine because he's already in control of the Senate.
And how they mention, we killed Dooku, and the cloud of the dark side hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, it just feels stronger. And Palpatine's standing right there!
Even in Clone Wars, Palpatine's like, every day we get closer and closer to victory, and he turns his back to them to smirk, and it's like, it's not beyond Palpatine's character to do something like that when he knows no one's paying attention to that side of him, but, oh man, yeah.
And then we get to a bit that I thought was kind of odd, but I suppose it kind of fits Anakin's character. The presumption that Padme isn't there to greet him, and he's just so freaked out by the concept that she might be preoccupied with her own things to do in life.
It was an odd choice, I feel, in some instances, but it does make sense because it's his fear of loss, and he'll go to the he'll go to the extremes if he thinks that anybody is going away from him because he's just so scared of losing anyone.
And that's why I feel like in the end this does fit his character really well. It seems like an odd point of view, or it seems like an odd point in the novel to have his point of view of the event from a person perspective, just because he's like, oh my gosh, she doesn't love me. Oh my gosh, she's doing something else when
she's in the Senate. The Senate that they did this to me. The Senate, I'm gonna destroy the Senate. Oh, what do you mean by official?
What about unofficially? And then 3PO has the most amazing line, and I said this in chat. 3PO just starts implying so much, and I'm like, you smug son of a Gungan.
He says, I'm just merely saying what I was told to.
And she wished for me to relate to you that she believes the both of you might avoid a public scene all afternoon, and perhaps all night as well.
Listening to that, I'm like, oh my gosh. 3PO is kind of savage. And I love it.
R2 is a horrible influence on him. I'm sure R2 the whole time is like, yeah, you know it.
But before C-3PO went over to Anakin, R2's like telling him all this stuff. He's like, hey, dude, say this. Tell him this.
Exactly. I'm sure 3PO has like no idea what he's saying, but R2 the whole time. Like, it's almost funnier if R2 is feeding him all of this to say. And
yes.
And 3PO's just saying it, and like as soon as Anakin leaves, R2's like, so, did you get all that? It's like, no, I just don't understand these organics.
And what I thought was kind of interesting was I initially thought, because I saw how many more minutes there was left of this chapter, I just kind of assumed that the chapter would end on the line, Annie, I'm pregnant. Because that was where we were at in the novel, and I was like, okay, that's where we're going to get to. But I thought it was kind of odd that we ended on a different note. And then I realized, in Legends canon, Anakin and Obi-Wan have been in the Outer Rim for months.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So, they would never have had the opportunity.
They only left, what? I mean, not long
6
enough.
or 7 months.
But I mean, Padme gives birth within 10 days of this rescue.
Padme is, like, she gives birth, like, within probably a few weeks.
So it's not much. Like,
I suppose I'm not familiar with how much of a span of time it was.
Like, they're humans, but we don't know, like, if there's since it's Star Wars, if there's, like, a different term period, I guess. So, like, Anakin was with Padme the last time probably around 5 or 6 months ago, which is a very, like, it's enough time for Padme to start showing signs that she is pregnant, which she does in the movie. Like,
and in the Bad Batch arc.
Yeah, and so she is very visibly pregnant. And so that is enough time.
I love that Anakin doesn't notice during the hologram until Padme says something.
Anakin's
Because
dumb.
we can
but
clearly see it in from the point of view that we're at in the Clone Wars. I'm like, you're clearly okay.
is there any like recorded lines, I guess, from people who very clearly see that she is pregnant? Or is it the kind of thing where they're like, oh, she's a senator, she has other stuff going on personally?
I'd say Bail Organa would cover for her most of the time.
He bails her out.
He bails her out, yeah. Well, I
and
mean,
she
but
has
that's
body
a good
doubles
point.
all the time.
Body doubles, her decoy.
Oh yeah, body doubles.
Because they could easily handle the majority of things, and then she goes into the those Senate pod things, and her tummy's covered up, and she leaves. Boom, done.
If she needs to be there, but she's not supposed to speak, she probably just sends a decoy who relays everything back to her.
That's true.
And if she does need to speak in front of a crowd, she probably just wears something large.
Yeah.
Which we know that she used to be a queen. She has plenty of larger garments.
The enormous gown that's like the traditional Queen Amidala look. It's like super big and flowy and everything. Yeah, that's a cool, probably the coolest of the Padme outfits. But yeah, it's interesting to see. Like, we definitely have a time jump between season 6 of Clone Wars and season 7, and of course, just like legends wise, we don't see Padme very much in the 2003 Clone Wars. And when we do see her, we actually, I hate to say it, but we don't see it, but we do have the implication of the moment that Luke and Leia are conceived.
Raiders of the Lost Ark much?
Chapter 8 ends with a quick conversation between Chancellor and Anakin, talking about how the Jedi Council are obstacles in the way of whatever Palpatine's trying to do, and how Palpatine says, well, they say, I believe I can be of some use to you in this problem after all. You can? I should be very much surprised if I couldn't. And once again, the parallels are just insane. Because on the one hand, you have Obi-Wan and Mace Windu talking about how the Palpatine has been blocking the Jedi Council at every turn, and Anakin and Obi-Wan are discussing what they could possibly do, with Mace Windu sort of acting as the catalyst for all of this. He's trying to convince Obi-Wan to go to his side so that they can find out whatever Palpatine's up to. And then here, you have Palpatine trying to convince Anakin to go over his side so they can find out whatever the Jedi Council is up to. So Anakin and Obi-Wan are really just two sides of the same coin the entire book.
They're going on kind of parallel journeys in a really weird way, and I'm kind of curious to see what that would look like more if that thread keeps developing as it goes, because I might try to look for more parallels between Anakin and Obi-Wan's journey.
And it's something I never considered, too, because, like, the Jedi and the Sith are so similar, and this book really nails that home, because Anakin and Obi-Wan are both the Jedi, but the Jedi are the Jedi are doing almost the exact same thing Palpatine is doing to Anakin, in that they're trying to indoctrinate Obi-Wan into whatever scheme they have, just on the suspicion that Palpatine is connected to the Sith. This book is so good, guys.
It really is.
I don't know how I finally convinced y'all to do it.
Glad you did. And I think with that's probably a good place to close it out, unless anybody has any final remarks. Next week, we will be reading Chapter 9, Padme, to Chapter 12, Not From a Jedi. So, if you are reading at home, read Chapters 9, Padme, to Chapter 12, Not From a Jedi. and you'll be where we are. And I think that is a good place to close it out. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, we have been joined today by
Jawa.
JC.
Jarrett.
and myself, Noah. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next week.